Comes to drafting edge rushers, there will be a few teams out there that decide to take a swing on a guy with big-time athletic traits that maybe just have not put it together yet. And you're betting on the upside of what could this become when all of these tools come together. And there will be other teams that may sit back and say, man, we'd like to get a guy that we know exactly what he's going to bring to the table. He looks like a long-term starter in the NFL. And today, we're going to be talking about Jack Sawyer, so let's get right into it. Before we get into today's video on Jack Sawyer, we are first going to take a look at our sponsor of today's video, and that is BetUS. So use code YouTube150 because you can get a 150% deposit match on your first deposit, 125% next two deposits, up to $2,000. Use it as your sign-up bonus if you're looking for your new sports book. But over here right now, you can see we have the future odds set. Next year's Super Bowl winner, Super Bowl 60. The odds are currently set. We got our Lions here at plus 1,000. But right now, Kansas City is the tied favorite. How good do we feel about that? Put in the comments below. I'm curious where people are at with Kansas City being tied favorite. It seems like a lot of people jumped off the bus, but they still got them at number one right now. Any sleepers in here? San Francisco at plus 1,400 after last season. Seems kind of wild, but I honestly understand it. Cincinnati, what the heck is going on with them this offseason? But I guess when you have Joe Burrow, you're just on this list. So if you guys want to get on the action for the futures, betting, say for the Super Bowl or for the NFL draft, check out BetUS. That's your place to do it. Now, let's get to today's video. So yes, we're going to be diving into Jack Sawyer today out of Ohio State. 6'4", just over 6'4", 260-pound defensive end. That's a little bit on the bigger side for most defensive ends that I've looked at to this point. And he clearly fits that mold. I mean, this is a play strength player. This is a consistent defender against the run that in the NFL, especially if a couple things dial in, you may not want to run the ball towards this piece. Now, there is inconsistencies technique-wise, especially when he has to deal with combo blocks, for example. But he's a play strength type of piece that for me right now in terms of grades really doesn't have any red flags or things that I'm extremely concerned about. He's a very well-rounded edge rusher that you may have just limited upside specifically as a pass rusher and what he can actually bring to the table, how often he can actually walk away with sacks. But the motor, the head on the shoulders, and also just the consistency with the toughness of which he plays, and also how that can translate if you're looked at as a number 2 edge rusher, could work really well in the NFL. So let's start, of course, with that ability to get off the ball. Let's start with that first step explosion. And he ended up giving a slightly above average grade here. There are things that I find consistent within his get off that separates him a little bit from others. For example, first off, the way that he gets out of his stance in a 4-point stance, 3-point stance, hand in the dirt, the ability to get up out of his stance, there is some burst to that. Now, at times, it can just lead to him standing straight up, but there is some burst within that process. He also does a nice job of covering depth within that first step, but also just being attacking. He doesn't really have any false movement off the line. It's immediate. He's immediately getting upfield, and those attacking strides can be incredibly effective, especially if there's an inside rusher and the offensive tackle has to worry about that. He can get an opportunity to gain an edge on offensive tackles because of that aggression that he attacks within that first step. And the fact that there is so much efficiency there and there isn't any false movement kind of points to his knee flexion and his ability to get out of awkward positions, foot forward, and launch himself within that first step. So the depth that he carries is big. The problem is there's just not a lot of twitch or really much explosion that feels into that first contact through that first step. Say if he's like hugged up on an offensive lineman, you don't feel that as much. And he does at times mistime the snap count a little bit. And I think that also leads to issues, not as jumping off sides, but falling behind maybe a gap responsibility, maybe being a little bit sluggish in terms of getting to his assignment and where he needs to be. For me, the twitch off the ball at this point is just very average. However, there is a nice little burst laterally as well. And this could be a super effective against the run. That ability on the backside of a run play to kind of close airspace. He does a really nice job of playing square to the line of scrimmage and using a lot of body control to stay balanced throughout the rep. He has good vision against the run. You'll see him kind of work down the entire line of scrimmage, and that's going to be a consistent theme with Jack Sawyer. Is you're also betting on the football intelligence, which is good right now in a lot of different categories, the head on the shoulders of this player. Now, the close ability could lead to some problems. I think out in space, finishing in space could be a little bit of an issue as well, just making tackles in space, even at times collapsing on a quarterback in the pocket. If he's on a little bit more of an island, you have an elusive quarterback, he may just miss those opportunities, and also just closing at the top of the arc as a pass rusher as well, due to some of the real stiffness and the lack of dip and bend that does show up in his game. I like the discipline that he plays with. I love the discipline to get upfield and kind of deal with boot action constantly. It feels like he's just due to make a couple plays where he just shuts down a boot play action and he just jumps on the quarterback immediately and he didn't even see it coming. I feel like a few of those are kind of in the future here for Jack Sawyer. And then, of course, when we get to the motor and those kind of things, he does play with a pretty hot shot motor for the most part. That feels like as the game rolls along, he stays very consistent. For me, I have him a slightly above average grade first step. There's a lot of consistency things that I like that I feel will translate. I don't see this really dropping off, but I don't see the ceiling being incredibly high here. Now, in terms of the play strength, this is where a lot of people are going to love Jack Sawyer because I ended up giving him a great grade here in terms of play strength. I think that he minimizes it at times, but truly, just as the natural play strength that he does carry, it is great. And it could translate both the pass rusher and as a run defender. Now, as a pass rusher, you don't see as much of that kind of explosion within the first step. You don't see some of that explosiveness like when slanting gaps as a pass rusher, where he can just create that immediate conversion speed to power as an inside rusher. It make you question some of that true play strength, but I think it's more back to the explosiveness and maybe the lack of suddenness than it is about the true play strength that he does carry. Multiple things. First off, as a run defender, he has an ability to kind of reset his base throughout a rep. The big thing you're going to notice is that there's real knee flexion in his game to work like laterally, for example, which definitely shows up. It adds to a lot of stoutness within his game. Knee flexion, there's some ankle flexion as well, which allows him to be pretty stout at the point of attack and constantly just hold his ground. Even when it's not a great entry point, he just finds a way to kind of hold his ground, not get pushed out of the play, stay to the square to the line of scrimmage. He plays with a lot of force through his hips immediately on contact, and he also plays with consistent leverage at the point of attack when working upfield or setting an edge as an edge defender. We'll see that he can lose a little bit of that force that's converted from the ground, and it could become a little bit more just his upper body, and he's kind of just feels like he's leaning on people. And I think that's back to some of the limited knee bend within his game, and again, some of that explosion and suddenness into contact. He'll turn into a little bit more of like I'm ducking my head, and I'm kind of just leaning forward, and it's more of a forward lean. It also throws off his lockout, which we'll talk about in a second, but I think that also limits some of the force that he can cause from the ground. But we do see that there is an ability to really carry momentum throughout his entire body into contact, which leads to some of that play strength. You'll see his ability to kind of split gaps and work through gaps and not really get knocked off balance, just continue working through a rep. Strength that he has through contact. I don't love his take on all the time against Polar specifically, but most teams kind of stay away from it because he definitely has the stoutness to handle guys at the point of attack. I just think at times the entry isn't ideal. He'll take guys straight on, limits opportunities to actually create shot opportunities. He's not the longest edge defender either, as we'll talk about here a little bit later, so he doesn't have some of that natural, just easy lockout length, so he really has to work for positioning, and it makes the entry points matter a ton. When his entry points are very good, you can see the effectiveness that he can carry. When he takes a guy full on and he doesn't have fantastic length, then you start to see him get kind of swallowed up, and it feels like he's very limited, especially initially at getting off a block. But he has that ability to be stout and sustain and continue working through the play. Constantly enters contact under an offensive lineman's chin. He gets under the pads a ton. He's always entering the chest of an offensive lineman. He plays with a little bit of a better pad level into entry points. Again, sometimes it's him just dipping his head down, but he does typically get underneath the chin of an offensive lineman, which leads to better leverage success. Like I touched on, he's very leveraged at the point of attack within his hip. And when he's working laterally down the line of scrimmage, he tends to keep his pad level pretty low. He tends to play in a position where, again, he can enter underneath of an offensive lineman's chin. So there's usually some good leverage that's created at the point of attack as a run defender specifically, which plays into this adaptive ability to set an edge base where he can adjust it, he can reset throughout the rep, and a lot of that to me comes back to the fact that he comes in with a really wide entry point. We'll get to the hands here in a little bit in a second, but he comes in with a really wide entry point and kind of a leveraged feel into the contact to kind of separate himself and ability to hold his ground and then reset as the play kind of works along. I typically really like his footwork into these edge sets. The first step as well, he's relatively quick getting into that point of attack. He typically sets himself pretty well within the lower body. But one of the biggest knocks in his play strength, again, we'll come back to, I think, some of the get off, which is he feels like he's losing steam into some of his bull rush opportunities. I also think that points to some of just the limited bend within his game, where, again, as a run defender, it doesn't show up as much because he can kind of lean on guys, but you'll see it as a pass rusher where you don't get as much bend, so it becomes a little bit more straight up, vertical, especially as a slant rusher, and there just isn't that much force created, speed to power in terms of some of those conversion opportunities. But play strength as a whole, it's great. It translates him well to be a strong side defensive end, deal with tight ends at the point of attack. He did a lot of good things against tight ends. The consistency there will be specifically when he works on tight ends is when he gets combo blocked, right? When he has to deal with the tight end and an offensive lineman. Not even two offensive linemen. This is a tight end offensive lineman. The base that he sets, ability to kind of hold his ground, create an anchor at the point of attack. Now, the real positive here is that he does have some of that knee flexion where he can corkscrew himself down and actually hold his ground like a big interior defensive lineman would. He has that capability in his game. So while I don't think he has has the best bend to sink himself down, which is why he's not always naturally under pads, which is why you'll see him kind of just lean forward to get under pads. He does have the flexion where he can really corkscrew himself down and settle down and create a lot of stoutness throughout a rep, reset throughout a rep, and not just get pushed off his spot 3 yards down the field. Like, that doesn't happen much at all. And to me, it shows back to that stoutness that he's able to create within the lower body. Would have loved to give him a higher grade here. I mean, statistically, he was very good last season. He had just under an 18% pass rush win rate, according to PFF. Of course, he had 10 sacks on the season. Did a lot of good as a pass rusher statistically. And I think that actually can be translatable. Not to that level, but he can be a translatable piece in the NFL as a pressure piece. The sacks, I think, will likely drop off outside of the fact that you'll get effort sacks because he constantly just works with the plays. But I think some of the pressure ability is potentially sustainable in the NFL, but it may not be that pretty in the NFL. So for me, I ended up giving him a slightly above average grade here as a pass rusher. I would have loved to go higher, but I think there's a multitude of potential limitations within his game, and right now there's still polish that needs to be added, whether that's a counter pass rush that needs to be added, whether it's just some of the limitations in terms of the dip and bend, even some of the misplays. I think timing with his hands needs to be improved, as we'll touch on, but there is still a lot of things to like as a pass rusher. There's a reason why he won as often as he did. First off, again, he gets leveraged into the point of attack as a bull rusher, so that allows opportunity to create immediate knockback at the point of attack. You see that immediately on contact, especially when he's working against offensive tackles. Love about him is you love his pacing, and you love the angles that he rushes offensive tackles with. His angles as a pass rusher on the edge are very successful. He has a nice little nuanced footwork approach where, again, because of the really successful first step, which doesn't have any false movement, it's very impactful off the line. A tackle has to get out early, but because of the depth and the aggressive strides that he uses within his footwork, he then can get an offensive tackle to settle himself in, and he can work half-man opportunities on that outside shoulder of an offensive tackle. He does open those opportunities constantly up to himself. His ability to continue pacing around the edge to cover a lot of depth. You also see a little bit of some of the flexion at times within the hips to kind of work into his crossover moves and kind of step through traffic specifically, but then also within his footwork, that ability to press and then still maintain depth around the arc allows him to create a lot of half-man opportunities just by the setup of his feet alone. Now, the lack of bend shows up as an issue to finish, but what it does do is it collapses the top of the pocket, and it can squeeze back into the pocket because the body control that he plays with, where he doesn't constantly run himself out of plays. Dip and bend is going to be limited, especially in the upper body. You'll see that as well. What I like is that he does a fantastic job, a lot of nuances. He does a fantastic job of not getting clean strikes against him. It's hard to get clean latches as he's working the arc. It's hard to get clean strikes on him because he has an ability to kind of just avoid those clean opportunities from an offensive lineman. But if he had a little bit more dip and bend, you'd see him slip more blocks a little bit easier. He still does a great job of not getting lashed when he's turning the corner. He just doesn't have some of that finishing dip and bend that you would like to see show up in his game. Ability to lean into contact. I love the ability to get his hips all the way into contact when he's trying to transition, speed to power. He rolls his hips through contact, which leads to that play strength, and that's very translatable and it's very consistent. He carries good core strength as well. It's just that his balance around the arc isn't fantastic. He's not a great agile piece. I have him as a below average grade right now in terms of agility. It'll show up a lot more in coverage, but it also shows up in just terms of the balance, being able to sustain balance as he's working around the corner as a pass rusher. He does attack creases well. He plays really tight to the line of scrimmage, and then he's got some of that stoutness to continue to work through traffic, which is something, again, that'll translate. It doesn't have to look pretty, but he'll collapse the pocket because of that, because it'll translate to the next level, even when he comes in an awkward spot. Pass rush rep from dying inside or outside. And usage, you'll see some of the issues that I do have here. One being misplaced opportunities, I think, at times with his hands. But I think you'll also notice with his hand usage as well, stop getting upfield sometimes because he'll leave the ground. I think the way that he kind of ties his hands and feet together aren't always that great. He's also very limited. You don't get a lot of inside wins from Jack Sawyer, specifically right now. There's not a ton of agility to his game because of some of the stiffness, especially in the upper body. You get a lot of limitations. There's not a lot of suddenness. There's not a lot of twitch within the lower body. There's not a lot of shake at the top of the rush either to kind of get an offensive tackle to overset. There's just not a lot of that. Even on the spin attempts, you'll see it's like, oh, that's a good setup, but he doesn't have the ability to really pry an offensive tackle open to allow that spin opportunity to set up on offensive tackles consistently. Also tend to get a little bit caught upright, and you'll see that within his pad level where he becomes vertical. This will especially show up, I think, late in reps. He loses the hand battle early, and there's not a lot of counter approaches, or specifically as he has to become a stunt rusher or even a slant rusher where he comes in way too upright and there's just no speed to power momentum that's created. Like his body control, he's got that kind of ability to stop and work through contact consistently through the rep. He maintains depth as he's working hand battles. Probably one of his biggest strengths, the ability to continue getting gaining ground on offensive tackles as he's working hand battles and covers so much depth. Act and open up those half-man opportunities specifically back to the angles that he plays with. I wish his agility was a little bit better, specifically in traffic to be an interior rusher. But what shows off with that is the crazy knee flexion. And this goes to the body control. He had this weird play that I watched this year. I'll show it on the screen where like somehow he split a guard, but I don't even know how he got off the ground like this. He was barely ever even on the ground. And it was just an ability within that flexibility to kind of cross an offensive guard's face and split the crease and get after the quarterback. But it looked like he was never even on the ground. It looked super unnatural, but it showed some of that flexion that he truly does carry and some of the lateral movement that showed up there. He's got, adequate foot quickness, but even if his footwork isn't super agile, there's some real flexion that does pop up within his game. Just to me, the stiffness can be an issue, especially when you're trying to reset. You're trying to create opportunities late in the play, speed to power late. It's not really there. It kind of tends to just stall out. Once it stalls out, it's kind of just over, and then he's just kind of driving himself forward. But set of speed to power can be a little bit limited as of now, which again, to me, shows up more so when he's stunting. I love the way that he strides. I love his pass rush angles. I love the way that he sells out inside and then gets back outside, and he's able to get those half-man opportunities. I just wish I would have seen more inside wins specifically. There's more counter pass rush moves, which I think ties back to his hands a little bit more. That would be great. Even when he, has an initial approach, it doesn't really string together very well with anything else. There's kind of an initial approach that's typically pretty good, and he's very reactive with his hands, but he doesn't string it together to his first pass rush attempt, so moves don't tend to string and continue working. It just kind of turns into, I'm going to just kind of push my guy back and see if I can create some pressure, and my first pass rush plan did tend to fail. Flashes of different opportunities, like you'll see a skip club move, wasn't very effective, but we did see it. You can see it with the footwork, you see it with the hands, you could see it with the timing. It was like, okay, this could be there. You see with the spin, but everything's much more flash in terms of really polishing that plan. Right now, it's a little bit more ugly wins as a pass rusher, but that just points to the upside that he truly does have as a pass rusher. Just right now, I haven't seen enough consistency or even the flashes for me to buy into a ton of that as of now. And then the run to pass opportunities, playing the run to rushing to passer, that has just been limited to this point as well. To the hand usage, his hand usage and his shed ability to me are both good. They both have their downsides, but they're both good at this point with definite opportunities to improve here. First off, in terms of the hands, what I like as a run defender is his hands are constantly inside. He plays with accurate entry points that are consistently inside as a run defender, but also as a pass rusher. His long arm move, you'll see this downside. It's, again, flashes, but it's not very consistent. I think, one, he doesn't have that much length naturally, and then when you tie into that some of just the lack of natural bend, his long arm move tends to be much more ineffective, and I just haven't seen it be effective to this point. I do like the timing and reactiveness to offensive linemen when they shoot their hands. His hands are typically ready to go. He's ready to counter off of that and work off of that. There's a two-handed swipe that we've seen with good timing. He's got fast hands in terms of it ties well, and it's very reactive to when an offensive lineman decides to throw punches. I just think that his plan could be absolutely misplaced, and there's also not a ton of suddenness within his pass rush approach. His lockout tends to be missing as well, and you'll notice this. Again, to me, this is back to a length issue. It also is to the issue of he can't always, kind of settle himself down, but also keep his back upright. He tends to just kind of lean over himself to kind of create that getting underneath pads. And because of that, he doesn't have much of a lockout opportunity. I mean, think about it. If you can bend and sit yourself out and then reach, you can create an opportunity to more consistently create lockout. However, when you're leaning forward and you're dipping your head to create leverage, that point you can't lock out. And I think that's why we see some lockout inconsistencies as a run defender at this point, which can lead to more shed issues than anything. You like the ready hands into his edge sets. The big thing there is he just becomes predictable because there's not a lot of suddenness when he's going to attack with his hands. Offensive linemen can kind of set up when they know he's going to strike because he kind of just leaves them out there. To some problems creating an early latch, and you'll see that as the rep unfolds, he typically gets himself in a good spot through his base. However, we could see that his early latch can be misplaced at times because an offensive tackle can kind of set him up. In terms of the shed ability, again, I think he's good here. I think it's back to the strong flexion that he carries through contact. He's able to find wins late. He's able to find a base and a little bit of an anchor late. He has an aggressive hand usage, right? There's some heavy hands. He truly is one of these guys that have heavy hands. You notice that goes back to his play strength at the point of attack. And even if it's just through the upper body, where sometimes, unfortunately, he seems like he's creating all his force from is just upper body because he's leaning, you still do see these heavy hands at the point of attack. He's well built through his frame, lower body, upper body. He's got a very well-built frame that looks NFL ready already. Like, he's already built to do that. He's already built to step in and play day one, it looks like, as a 4-year senior, which makes a ton of sense. The lack of sync, again, to me, leads to inaccurate ability to actually create lockout, which can kind of pull back on a shed shed ability, but you see a lot of push-pull success specifically, which is great, especially against tight ends. You'll see that through the accurate entry, the way he kind of times up tight ends, and then that ability to just kind of step past tight ends through contact, the ability to step past contact. Ties it well where he's got these single-handed strikes where, okay, I'll lock out here, and then I'm going to walk over here. It's really timed well with his hand usage and his footwork. That's where that shows up the most, when he's able to lock out and then continue to work through reps rather than taking both hands off and then trying to step by. He keeps one locked out, he'll slide through. So he does a really nice job with that. Typically accurate in terms of his entries on zone blocks. He's typically accurate. Now, on the front side, I think he'd be a little bit misplaced, like trying to settle down on an offensive tackle, but he's typically pretty accurate. Even if he's a slanting into a gap, into the B gap, he's pretty accurate in the way that he enters into the point of attack to at very least fill his lane. Can he work over top? Sometimes not, because he didn't lock out, but he's typically accurate to where he places himself in those spots, and it's his early placement that leads to better shed ability. I think he could take a little bit better angles when taking on blocks head on specifically. I look at Jack Sawyer as a guy that can play strong side defensive end. I think he's unlikely to maybe want to live as an outside linebacker unless you just typically only use him as a pass rusher, because I think his coverage, while he does a good job football intelligence-wise, he's good because he'll get good depth, and you do see some fluidity in the half turn to be able to create some depth, and he typically gets to pretty good spots. There's not a ton of agility in space, however, so he's just going to kind of post a spot, which is fine, but you could do that as a defensive end. He can kind of post into a spot and kind of just settle in. And then there's also the fact that he's pretty explosive and aware of getting into passing lanes, which is nice. He's aware of targets that cross his face, so he picks up on those things. And again, same thing with the boot action. He's got a good head on his shoulder. He's got a good discipline to his game. But with some of the lack of agility in space, I think it also will show up as an open field tackler. You probably don't want him dropping into coverage too often. He's capable, but that's not where you want him to live. But he can get into assignments properly. That's truly a part of his game. And obviously, we've seen him make a couple of those big plays this past year for Ohio State. Pocket pushing presence. That's what he's going to be at the next level. I think he's going to probably struggle to find consistency with sacks outside of effort sacks, where his motor just runs hot, and as the game goes along, kind of runs into some sacks because he just keeps working, and he has a skill set that can keep working and make it ugly and just find a way to keep collapsing a pocket. But in terms of, like, can he beat a tackle and then slip and dip and then get a close, that's probably be more inconsistent. He'll probably miss some quarterbacks in the pocket as well due to the lack of length and lack of some of that natural bend. But his effort will prevail in those spots. I think he's a well-rounded starter as a strong side defensive end. I think he could start day one in the NFL, which is fantastic. I think there's going to be some limitations to what he can actually become as a pass rusher. I think there will always kind of be some sort of a ceiling there, but I think there's more polish that can be there. I just don't think he'll ever be a great pass rusher, but I think he could be a good pass rusher at the next level, that if you have him as your number 2 rusher, then you're in a really good spot. I just wouldn't want to look at him and be like, he's got to be our pass rusher. If he's got to be the guy, that's probably not ideal. He could probably do it, especially against some struggling offensive linemen, but if he could be your number 2, that's ideal as just a pocket pusher, pocket collapser. Length, explosion, and bend are the problems to me, but I think he's a long-term player. He can last a long time in the NFL, play for a long time. That, to me, as your number 2 pass rusher and as a skill set to play the run with good football intelligence, great toughness, and a very hot motor, I think this is the kind of piece that a lot of teams are going to look at and say, that guy can help us right now. Whoever we are, he could help us right now. Ceiling, we'll see, but he can help us right now. So I ended up giving Jack Sawyer a 6.3 grade. Now, you're going to see how that sorts out within kind of my final rankings here. Again, these things can change, but as of now, that's where I'm at with Jack Sawyer. Could that be round 1? Maybe. I think maybe at the end of round 1 again for some of those better teams that are looking for like an immediate impact player. There you go. That kind of piece would make sense. He feels like he has more of kind of a day 2 feel to him, but I think he could get into day 1 because he's going to make an immediate impact. To bet US, use that code YouTube150.